How is everyone?
Well,
You doing all right? What about them Yankees, huh? Nice. As always, it's an honor and a privilege to speak and share God's word to the saints on the first day of the week. And it's also a privilege to share Ephesians chapter 2 with our elder, Al Baker, who did an amazing job. Give it up for Al one time. Right? As we go and talk about God's plan. Now, the better the plan, the greater the obstacle, right? And since we're talking about God's plan, there's some major obstacles that tries to impede what God has in store for us. And one of those obstacles that we're going to discuss today is othering. Now, othering is any action by which an individual or group becomes mentally classified in somebody's mind as not one of us. Rather than always remembering that every person is a complex bundle of emotions, ideas, motivations, reflexes, priorities, and many other subtle aspects, it's sometimes easier to dismiss them as being in some way less human and less worthy of respect and dignity than we are. This is the thing that impedes the unity that God has in store in his plan. Now, the first part of Ephesians 2 discusses that already. It classifies the issue and it gives us the cure, which is the cross, which is God's redemptive power through the shedding of his son's blood. Now what we're going to talk about is, well, what does that look like? What are the effects of these two separate people groups accepting this free gift from God? Right? That's what we're going to focus on today. Now, in verse 11, it starts off with a very powerful word, right? Therefore, right? Okay. Therefore is pretty powerful. Why? Because it alerts the reader or the listener that whatever was said or heard prior to is a setup for what's to come, right? Now, in battle rap, that's called a rhyme scheme, okay? In most rap verses, the punchline comes within 2 to 4 bars. Real simple setup. But for a rhyme scheme, it's sometimes 16 to 24 bars. For great rhetorical effect, if you do it properly. Entire rap battles have been won or lost based on the effectiveness of a rhyme scheme. Now, why is that important? Well, it builds momentum. Because as the person speaks, you're thinking, okay, where's this person headed with this? What's the punchline? Where are they going to land with this, right? And that's what Paul does in the first part of the chapter. He does a scheme for us, right? And what's the scheme? Well, I'm a Jew and you're a Gentile. And though we're vastly different people, we both have the same issue, sin. You have a target on your back. I got the same target on mine. God's the shooter, and this guy never misses. So what are we going to do about this? Because it's not a you problem, and it's not a me problem. It's a we problem. And the cure for this, the way we get this target off our back is the cross. Right? And that's the first part. The second part is, well, what are the ramifications of these people groups becoming one? What happens? What occurs? Right? So that was the lineup. Here comes the punchline. All right? So in Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 11, therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. And in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who are far away and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, which Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. There's a lot to unpack, right? We're talking about circumcision, citizenship, building towers and temples, getting peace. And for those of us who live now in New York City in 2019, we might not get the punchline too well. This might not connect because there's so many different types of contexts that we might not be familiar with, right? For us, Ephesians 2 is kind of like that movie that starts at the end. You ever seen those kind of movies? Right? The movie opens up and the guy's being chased by somebody or he's in some precarious situation. And you're like, what in the world's going on? Right? And then the film freezes, right? And then the guy, the main character will say, hey, my name is so-and-so. You're probably wondering how I got in this situation. Well, it all started, and then the screen goes, woo, 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 and then it's a flashback, right? So we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to do a flashback. So we're going to do, right? All the way back to Genesis 11, verse 1 through 9. Now, we're not going to go through the whole passage, but basically we know the story. We know about the Tower of Babel, right? At this time, there are no nations. There's just one people group, just one family, God's human family. And after a lot of false starts, God decides, you know what? We're going to reset the button and we're going to try to do what we try to do in Genesis. I want you to go out, populate the earth, and be one big happy family. And that human family says, no, we're not going to do that. Well, instead, we're going to build this temple. In the ancient Near East, this edifice will be known as a ziggurat. A ziggurat is basically a cosmic Airbnb for a pantheon of ancient Near Eastern deities. It's like an airport for these different gods to come and visit. Because in the ancient Near East, people believe if you want an audience with a god, you need a mountain. Well, we have no mountain, we're going to make one. Thus, the temple. And why they love these gods so much? Well, these gods were basically supernatural vending machines. You go, put in your offering, you press your button, and you get what you want. They didn't want a relationship with Yahweh. They wanted business transactions with these other gods. And God was livid with this action. And though this is his family, he is so mad, he wants to kill them. I know the parents can relate. I love you. Killing is wrong, but it's got to be some kind of leeway, you know, if I can unbirth you somehow, you know, it's because you're getting me on my last nerves, man. Like, what's going on? This is how God feels. So God says, you know what? Usually I throw you out the garden. I do a cataclysmic flood. This time, I'm leaving. I'm out. And those guys you like so much, you can have them. Have fun with that. See how that works out for you. And God exits. But he still loves his family, though. So he devises a plan. And the plan begins with a man, Abram. And what's the plan that he gives Abram? Well, he decides to grant Abram a very special contract that is known throughout the ancient Near East as the Royal Grant Covenant. And what that entails is this covenant is also a covenant made between a stronger and a weaker party. However, in this case, it is not the rights of the suzerain, the stronger party, that is protected, but the rights of the vassal, the weaker party. The curses in this covenant is against anybody that would infringe upon the rights of the vassal. The other difference we see is that this covenant is normally the result of the loyalty of the vassal towards the suzerain. Thus, it is seen as a reward for loyalty and is guaranteed by the stronger party. we also see that this reward is normally land and dynasty. This means that the land is not only the property of the vassal, but also of his descendants. This implies that as part of this covenant, the boundaries and characteristics are clearly defined. The suzerainty covenant was ratified in a ceremony in which both parties would walk between the split animal pieces, but a royal grant was ratified in a ceremony in which the suzerain would walk between the pieces alone. So it's a unilateral contract. It is not a covenant. God is doing all the heavy lifting here. And all Abraham has to do is agree and believe that it is. Now, what you see here is actually a boundary stone from Babylon that has a royal grant covenant inscribed on it. So what will happen is as you walk and you go into this territory, you find this tablet, and this tablet says, check this out. This right here, this is my man's land right here. I'm the king. So behave yourself as you walk through here, because if you trip, you're going to have to see me and my empire, because this is one of my favorite servants. In fact, walk around the land. Don't even go in. Don't even play yourself. Just live. Don't do it to yourself, because this is my servants, right? And this is a grant that God gives to Abram, who becomes Abraham. Now, let's look at this a little closer, right? Let's look at this grant that God gives Abraham, all right? Genesis 17, verse 1 to 14. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you will greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and to your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Then God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you ought to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or brought from money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring, whether born in your household or brought with your money. They must be circumcised. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. What happened here from the Tower of Babel, from their rebellion, God causes them to have different languages, and these people now disperse. And that's where we first get geopolitics. All these different nations, different cultures, nationalism has been brought forth based on their rebellion towards God. Wow. Yes. So the otherness is rebellion from God. Right. So God says, I'm going to use that to my favor. So I'm going to pick Abram, make you Abraham, and the nations that will come from you will eventually worship me. Notice how he says nations. It's not nation. That the covenant is that eventually these people who rebelled and became the other will all come back and worship me. Amen. And the sign is the circumcision. So circumcision was actually a sign of inclusion and not exclusion. That's what the sign was. But of course, something went wrong along the line, right? Because now it's a distinction, right? It's me and you. You're the other guy. And how I know is because of circumcision. But the whole thing was, no, you're supposed to be with me because of circumcision, right? So that was the flashback. Hope you enjoyed that. We go back to the text now with this information, and now we could look, and now hopefully it connects more for us. Now we get the punchline, right? So it says here, in him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. Paul wasn't being poetic when he was telling the church in Ephesus this. He was talking about the Tower of Babel. Because that was the first time where you had a group of people who were not many nations building this temple. But now we're doing it again, but we're going to do it right this time. Amen. We're building this temple, but to Yahweh. And the biggest difference is, and back then, the temple was used as a connector to you and your God. Paul says, you're the connector. You're the material that helps connect you with God. But not just you, but the Jewish guy next to you. And that together, you connect with me. That's what he means by this. All right? For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. This idea of peace was something that the politicians of the day were very much, into. It was the ideal way to operate. And Odysseus, who devoted himself to a vigorous campaign for the ending of war between Athens and Sparta, has turned the clause "make peace" into a catchphrase and is on the peace with the Lacedaemonians. Plutarch argued that it remained for every ideal statesman to involve himself in noble activities which instill concord and friendship and remove strifes, discords, and all enmity. This was popular talk in the CNN and the MSNBCs of the day. This was a very solid talking point. Peace. Let's have peace, everyone. Now, of course, they meant peace under the Roman Empire, but peace nevertheless, So the people in Ephesus heard these things. So when Paul's talking about he himself is our peace, what Paul is telling Ephesians is, the way they heard it, is that Jesus is the ideal statesman. He is the one, the only one, that can bring peace to these factions. Right. And not only does he bring peace, he's the peace that you are brought in. So he's beyond any politician or any statesman. Right? Remember that at the time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners. We'll stop right there. So in the Greek, citizenship is politia. It's a body politic, right? It's a political term. And Dionysius of Halicarnassus says here, for a city-state is composed of many classes of people, not at all resembling one another, every one of which contributes some particular service to the common good, just as its members do to the body. Gee, that sounds awfully familiar, right? We've heard Paul use that same metaphor a few times, right? It didn't originate with Paul, right? This is something that the people in Ephesus would have been familiar in hearing, right? This idea of a confederation of these different people groups coming together under one banner, right? We live in such a place, right? This is the United States of America, right? Every state has its own flag, its own sports team. Let's go Yankees, But yet we're under the same banner, right? So by accepting Christ and his gift, both Jew and Gentile can now be under the same body politic. But understand that this body politic, right, even though it's united, it's not uniformed. There's a difference, right? We're united, but it's not uniformed, right? The Gentiles come in, but they don't have to be Jews to be under this new body politic. In fact, the whole letter to the church in Galatia is just about that these Judaizers were trying to tell these Gentile Christians that, well, if you're going to be part of Israel, you got to look like Israel. So let's get to circumcising. And Paul rails against that. because that's not important. So if I look differently than you do, it doesn't make me any less of your brother, right? If I speak a different language, if I eat a different type of food, if I have a different sense of humor than you based on my culture, that doesn't separate me from you, does it? Because that's what Paul's saying. These things can still be imported into the body politic and still be united. I don't have to be you. You don't have to be me. But we both got to be like Christ. That's the thing that Paul is trying to get across here. That's the body politic. Also, because we're talking political, Paul is talking some dangerous things. Because there's already a body politic in place here. All right, we're talking about the Roman Empire. So he's talking about a different body politic within a body politic. We have a word for that. It's called sedition. This is what Paul is preaching about. That if you make Jesus Lord, because supposedly there is a Lord there, Caesar. Right. But if you're going to be under the body politic of God, you have a new Caesar. That's Jesus. You ever wondered why the Christians get persecuted so heavily? Even though they're loving people and they take care of the sick, why would they imprison them? Why would they kill them? Well, unlike here, there was no difference between church and state in ancient Rome. There was no difference between the supernatural and the natural in Rome. The gods were very much part of the political process of Rome. So if you don't take a knee to Zeus and Hermes, it is an act of sedition. The minute you said Jesus Lord, you was in trouble. You was a rebel. You was being radicalized by the gospel. So this unity was going to cause some serious problems with the Roman government. And also, most of the people that lived in Ephesus at that time were not Roman citizens. So this idea of gaining citizenship resonated with the people in Ephesus. Because with citizenship comes privilege and rights and protection. And that's what the gospel provides, right? We are all privileged if you make Jesus Lord. Our sins are forgiven. Our names are written in heaven. You know, we have God's Spirit dwelling inside us. Amen. That's some serious privilege there, yes. Right? But it also causes you to be the enemy of the states if you are united in Christ by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. This is actually kind of a stiff translation, because when you look at the Greek, it's more like its commands expressed through regulations. And why is that a thing? Well, in the Tanakh, right, what we call the Old Testament, there's laws and there's statutes and there's commandments, right? There are differences. And Moses makes sure that we understand these differences, right? Moses makes it very clear what exactly is the covenant, right? In Exodus 34, verse 28, he says, Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. That's what the covenant is. Anytime you hear someone mention the covenant, they're talking about this specific grouping of laws, the 10 commandments, right? Regulations are different. These are ordinances, things that Israel had to do, right? Here's a few right here. It says here, do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. You find that in Leviticus 19:27. You are to make tassels on the corners of your garments with a blue cord in each tassel, Numbers 15:38. Various rules about clean and unclean food in Leviticus 11. Why was that a big deal? Well, these things were signs and indicators of who Israel was. So it could be very clear to the rest of the world who Israel is. Why? Well, Israel had God, the true and living God. And their job, via the promise that God made to Abram, was to have the nations come to Israel to learn about God. That was Israel's job. They were supposed to be a nation of priests in the book of Exodus. And what's a priest? A priest is what? A mediator between a people and a God.
Right.
So if you have a nation of priests, who are they mediating for? Everybody else, the nations. But because of their rebellion, they went from being a nation of priests to one tribe, the Levites. Now, there's many scriptures I could share about this concept, but I'm going to share what the prophet Zechariah said about this. He said, this is what the Lord Almighty says. In those days, 10 people from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, let us go with you, because you have heard that God is with you. Because that was their job. Their job was to gather the nations back from the othering, from being a foreigner, becoming one people group again. This is what Israel was supposed to do. Because if you want to get well, you want to make sure that the hospital has a big sign that says hospital, right? So you know exactly where to go to. Well, these ordinances, the beards and the circumcision and the tassels, this was a big sign saying, come here when you're ready to follow the true and living God. Because nobody misunderstood who a Hebrew was. It was very clear who they are. Right? The ordinances was a sign saying, hospital, come get cured. We have God. But the ordinances, instead of being this huge hospital sign, became the most exclusive club with the tightest door policy in the planet. They changed it to that. It's like, oh, no. These fringes? No, because we're special. You don't have them. You can't come in. You like this beard, right? You don't have one. You can't come in here. You know, you eat that pork? You can't come to the club. He's going to throw you right out. You're not one of us. They misused the ordinances. So Christ got rid of them. He got rid of all these things that indicate any difference between Israel and the rest of the world. Because the very thing that was supposed to bring people together, you were using to keep people apart. So that was the exegesis of the text, right? That's what it meant to them at that time, right? So how does that work for us today, right? Well, Paul was reminding the church these things. And there's two things that he helped remind the church back then that he needs to help remind for us today. And the first thing is, stop looking at the other. You have to stop, because one of the most fatal things about othering is that you never really get to look at yourself. You never have to, because that's the bad guy. And if he's the bad guy, I'm automatically the good guy, right? If you're Darth Vader, I'm Luke Skywalker. I mean, who else I'm going to be in my head, right? But this othering causes a separation. It causes a have and have not dichotomy. It causes privilege. Now, there's many types of privilege, all right? And the first one I would like to talk about is the one that probably get me in the most trouble. White privilege. John shouldn't let him wear the kufi. Now he's militant. Hold on. Before you throw me off the stage, hold on. I know white privilege can be a trigger word for many of us. Because in our minds, how am I privileged? I get up every morning like everybody else. You know, I grind out a living every day. I live check by check. I have as many problems and issues as everybody else. And you would be correct. White privilege doesn't mean you don't have any problems. It just means being white isn't one of them. That's what we mean by white privilege. And it's not necessarily your fault, but you are the beneficiary of a specific type of othering. Because someone looks different than you, they get treated differently. The parameters are rigged against someone else because they're the other. And we have to be aware of that, because when our black and brown brothers talk to you about the things that's going through in their lives, they're not crazy. They're not making stuff up. They're not making excuses. They're victims of othering. And we have to be aware of that. And that's hard, because trying to show somebody that they're privileged is kind of trying to show a goldfish in an aquarium that he's wet. It's kind of hard. It's kind of hard because they've always been wet. What do you mean I'm wet? What are you talking about? So another form of privilege is male privilege. I'm hurting feelings? I'm sorry. Not really. Again, it's not that men don't have issues. It's that being a man is not one of them. You know, very few of us, unless you're some sort of Hollywood heartthrob, don't have to worry about strange women following you on your way back home. But for a lot of women in this room, that's a daily occurrence. You know, a woman just grabbing you by the hand and say, come here, let me talk to you, is very odd. But that's rush hour for most women. Right? But when the sisters talk about that, oh, they're being emotional. No. They're being othered. They're being othered, and we have to be aware of that. Because those things cannot be in God's kingdom. We can't look at the other person. There ain't no other. Yes, ain't is a word, it's in Webster's. There ain't no other. Not in here. Not in this room. Othering has some amazing effects on people for the worse. I know it because I've been a victim of othering. Because, you know, when you're a little kid, you know, we like to snap and tease, you know, and a lot of times it's just fun. But it can turn mean very quickly. And, you know, there's always that one kid that everybody kind of zero in on, and we're going to focus all our negativity on that person. I was that person. Every day I was told in great detail how I am not like everybody else. You know, to the blacks, I was too Puerto Rican. To the Puerto Rican, I was too black. I did well in school, so that made me white. Being honest with you. Other people who were being othered me every day. And it had a horrible effect on me. You know, a lot of us, we cultivate ambition and passion, and we become go-getters. I allowed the othering to short-circuit that in me. It's only now that I'm starting to try to advance and make something of myself, to be quite honest. It's only now. And if I'm going to keep it all the way 100 with you, thank you. I've been othered in the church as well. I've been told, you're not really that spiritual, bro. You know, I don't think you're going to last in the church. I've been told that. And it hurts. Especially when it comes to people who really should know better. But I have to say that you guys have definitely been a great help when it comes to that. You know, people like John Makowski, Al Baker, Mark Thompson, the people in my family group, and countless others who are sitting in these nice plush red velvet seats. You are a part of my healing. And I thank you for that. But understand, othering does something to people. Sometimes we other when we're thinking that's a good thing. Like, hey man, it's not so bad. At least you're not like this guy. That's othering. Or when your child doesn't want to finish their Brussels sprouts and you tell them, finish up because there's hungry children in Africa. Some of you have used that. As if there's no starving children in America. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands that go hungry every day. But a whole continent, though, we're going to talk about them. So now these kids grow up thinking that there's no food in the continent of Africa. You straight over an entire continent. We can't do that if we're God's children. There ain't no other if we accept Christ. And the only way we cannot be othered is if you start to look at Jesus. Amen. We have to stop looking at the other and start looking at Jesus and what he's done for us. Being beaten beyond human likeness, whipped, embarrassed, othered, so that you can have your forgiveness, something you don't deserve. right? Because when you look at the cross, you got to look at yourself now. And you got to have a sober estimate of who you are and how you are really an object of wrath, that you are deserving of eternal condemnation. But that's not God's plan for you. That was never his plan for you. His plan was to have his people come together. No more nations, no more Jew, no more Gentile, no more othering. Because as we focus on the cross and on Christ, we become one through osmosis. Without Christ, it's not going to happen. I mean, I don't think I got to convince you of that. Just watch the news every day. We're being othered left and right by design. But we have to repel against the othering of the world. We need to show that that is not God's plan. We are the true God's body politic, and Christ is our king. And we're not going to allow the world to keep us apart. We are God's family. It's God's promise from Abraham to us. And think about it. Think about all the millenniums that passed. And God is still concerned with keeping his promise to one man. How many times Christ has course corrected just so that we can fulfill this royal grant given to one man? We are the beneficiaries of the royal grant of Abraham. This is it. This is what's happening here. It's the united front of all being uniformed. That, you know, I could look vastly different from you, and we're still in the same body politic. And that's what we got to focus on. We got to focus on Christ. Because if we do, we build an amazing tower. We build an amazing body politic. But it's on us, though. The onus is on us, which is kind of scary, right? Because God says, you guys can do it. Yeah, I see me small. So we can do it if there ain't no other. So that it could be fulfilled, so that we can enjoy the benefits of God's plan. Thank you for your time.